Very warm welcome. Thank you for joining us today to our event, Europe's Future Trade Strategy, Free, Fair, Open, ? So that's what we want to discuss with you today. My name is Malte Lohan. I'm delighted to be your host and your moderator for the next 90 minutes. Now, many of you will know Orgalim. We are the organization that at the European level represents the mechanical, electrical, electronics, ICT, and metal tech sectors. Our companies make everything from advanced manufacturing equipment like industrial robots to sensors used for automated mobility, components for 5G, for smarter buildings, for energy grids. And the 770,000 companies in our industries include some big multinational names like Siemens, Bosch, Schneider Electric that you will know, but most of them are SMEs and micro companies that are not household names perhaps, but that are the hidden champions at the heart of Europe's digital and climate transformation. And all of those companies are deeply dependent on trade with global markets across the world for their continued success. Our companies together represent around 1/3 of Europe's manufactured exports. Now, clearly the subject today is of great interest. If we can go to the next slide, please. And if you only look at the level of registrations, 220 plus of you have registered for today, there's clearly a huge amount of interest in this. Our event today is part of a broader series, our Industrial Strategy in Focus events. You will find more on those on our website. You're warmly invited to join our upcoming event on Europe's artificial intelligence strategy and industrial AI in particular. Now let's go to the next slide, please. Why is today's topic so important? At the core of our policy vision is a renewal of Europe, where industry is creating new prosperity for Europe's citizens. And to achieve this, we see what we call 3 strategic imperatives for Europe. First, we need to embrace the transformation of industry and make full use of this potential of digitalization across manufacturing in Europe. Second, we need to transform societal challenges like climate change into future drivers of prosperity. And third, we need to enable our industry's global leadership in a much more complicated, much more unpredictable global environment. And this is where trade comes in. Open, rules-based trade, improved access to international markets are absolutely key for achieving this. Now, next slide, please. No surprise, I guess, to anyone joining us today that our industries have also been hit hard by the current crisis as everyone else. For our industries, this is the worst crisis since World War II. We are seeing a 19% fall in production in the first 6 months of the year. Europe's electrical and electronics sector suffered the least, but even so, that sector saw a 14% drop. Our industries account for some 2 trillion euros in turnover. So you can imagine the damage caused when we are facing some 400 billion euros in lost turnover. So the 19% reduction that we have seen in the first half. Second half of the year is not looking promising from everything we can see at the moment either. And the damage, of course, will be felt also in jobs. We are employing 11.5 million people directly in our industries across Europe, and we expect up to 5% of those jobs to be lost. So around 500,000 jobs across Europe are directly at risk as a result of the crisis. Now, to recover, our companies depend on global access to markets, to supply chains. Global trade is a strength when we talk about the recovery from the crisis. Next slide, please. Unfortunately, that view is not universally shared. Beyond the economic cost, the crisis, which was caused by the pandemic, has also catalyzed a trend to what you could call deglobalization. And you will all remember the stories in the media in the spring about gaps in supplies of medical equipment, gaps in supplies of medical devices. And this has provoked a wider concern that supply chains, global supply chains, are a vulnerability, that countries cannot rely on global partners in times of crisis. And of course, this started before the pandemic, and both the US and China have been looking to become more autonomous for a while, not just as a result of the pandemic. We are seeing an increasing decoupling of major economic blocs, especially when it comes to technology, so to the core products represented by our industries. And we're seeing this here in Europe too. Political leaders are now calling for greater autonomy and sometimes, perhaps not in those words, for greater protectionism. So as the EU crafts a new trade strategy, the stakes couldn't be higher for our industries and for Europe as a whole. And I'm delighted to introduce you to our speakers today who will help us shine a spotlight on the choices Europe is facing and how to make the most of the opportunities ahead. In a moment, I'll hand over to the Orgalim president, Rada Rodriguez, who will set the scene for our discussion. Beyond her Orgalim role, Rada is Senior Vice President, Corporate Alliances at Schneider Electric and is a member of the board of Schneider Electric Germany. She's also a member of the executive board of ZVEI, the German Association for the Electrotechnical Industries, and she serves as a non-executive director on the board of James Hardie Industries PLC. To bring the Commission's view, I'm happy to welcome Kevin Carey, representing DG Trade and a member of former Commissioner Hogan's cabinet. Kevin is stepping in at very short notice to replace Ms. Meln Geile from the cabinet of Executive Vice President Dombrovskis. She was required in another meeting as we speak. Thank you, Kevin, for joining at short notice and great to have you with us. To bring the perspective of an SME, I'm really happy to welcome René Brandes. René is the CEO of FIB Belgium, company founded in Antwerp in 1936 and a leading global supplier of equipment used to process steel wires. The company serves more than 60 countries worldwide across all continents, and René has been CEO of FIB Belgium since 1996. To bring the perspective of a multinational publicly traded company, I introduce to you Eva Larsen. Eva is the lead public affairs advisor at Vestas, a Danish wind turbines manufacturer that many of you will know, with production in 16 countries all over the world. Eva also has extensive experience in the public sector with the Danish Ministry for Energy, Utilities and Climate and at the Danish delegation to the OECD. Then I'm happy to introduce to you Garrett Workman. Garrett is Director of European Affairs at the US Chamber of Commerce. He's joining us from Washington, DC this morning to bring a transatlantic perspective. And Garrett is deeply engaged in all the current EU-US negotiations, as well as the conversations with the UK, and representing here today the wider US business community viewpoint. Last but certainly not least, I'm very happy to welcome Hosuk Lee Makiyama, Director of the European Center for International Political Economy, a leading think tank focusing on global economic issues. And Hosuk is regularly consulted by governments on issues related to WTO, OECD, APEC, G7, G20, and he served in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Sweden, including as a representative to the WTO and the UN. So a really fantastic lineup of speakers for our discussion today. The bios of all the speakers are available for download on the handout link. Let me say a few words about our program today, just to explain how we will use the remaining 90 minutes, remaining 80 minutes or so that we have left. So I will hand over to Rada for her opening remarks in a moment, and then we will go straight to our panel discussion. I will give each speaker the floor for some opening remarks, and then we will open the Q&A with all of you invited to participate. Please use the questions box in the chat. and I will do my utmost to take on board the questions that you're asking. So let's get started. Without any further ado, I give the word to Rada Rodriguez, Orgalim President.
Thank you, Malte. Thank you for this very nice introduction and also for setting the scene for this very important event. As you mentioned, we have over 220 attendees, which is also proving the importance of the trade policy for the industrial strategy in Europe and also for the competitiveness of Europe. So, happy to be here today to introduce the topic from our point of view, and I would like to hook to what Malte was already saying about our industrial strategy. It is important to understand that our companies are in a global competitive, very hard competitive situation, and we compete by innovation, with innovation. So we really put the innovation at the heart of our strategy. And doing this for many years, for decades now, we have also succeeded to create these fantastic technological champions, which we have all around Europe, and which are a proof for our capability and capacity to innovate and to keep this high competitiveness in this high speedy change of technology. We were also hearing from Malte about the big societal challenges, and as we want to transform or to use those challenges in order to drive prosperity. And as we all know, this big challenge today is the twin transformation, the twin green and digital transformation. So trade, yes, is at the heart of our industry, and it's the way in which we have maintained our long-term and global leadership. So please allow me to bring the two main points of discussion today as we see it. So it was already also mentioned by Malte, the situation of the COVID-19 crisis. And this is actually framing the context of the current debate. We have seen how our industry were suffering, and not only our industry, the whole European industry is deeply suffering from this crisis, and we need to do everything which is in our power to rebound as soon as possible. The second point which we need to discuss is the link between the trade policy and the industrial strategy. It's the only way to do, to have a constructive dialogue about these topics. So coming back to the first point, the COVID-19 impact. There are, we see increasingly questions regarding trade policy linked to this crisis. And the most important discussions are always around this topic of open strategic autonomy. But we don't see that there is a clear definition of what that means. We see that in some cases this is interpreted as reshore, so more production back to European Union. It can also be seen as a way to shortening the company supply chain, so what we call the nearshoring. But on the other hand, it is also a requirement we have to the European Union to remain open and to trade with third countries and regions, as our international value chains are extremely integrated. So it is very important that we agree on a common understanding of what it means, open strategic autonomy, in order to be able to have this constructive discussion. However, we realize that this is not easy. It's pretty difficult as there are so many different interests around the topic. But anyhow, we will need to find a path to move forward. Beside the common understanding of what it means or what we mean with in Europe with open strategic autonomy, we have also all the questions related to the role of the international supply chain when it comes when we see disruptions like we have seen now in the COVID-19 situation, and also how resilient these international supply chains are. It's clear that we have a big need everywhere that Europe is more resilient, and I will come back in 1 minute to explain how we see on this resiliency. And the discussion has to be around how we want to achieve this resiliency. So the second point of discussion which I would like to introduce is this link between the trade policy and the industrial strategy. Here we are convinced that Europe should remain open to world trade. As our international value chains are extremely integrated, we should not cut ties from these global ecosystems and international value chains. We should not forget that these complex, integrated global value chains are not something which happened overnight. It's the result of the last 20, 30 years of integration. And it was not only a driver for efficiency for the companies, it was also a main driver for innovation. Because by integrating the companies along the value chain and over the latest, let's say, decade, more and more digital integration of the ecosystem along the supply chain, we were driving also digitization, we were driving advanced manufacturing solutions, we were driving digital solutions, and that is all about innovation. Now, when it comes to the resilience of the European industry, what we mean by that is that we need to master and we need to diversify the global value chains. It means also the collaborative leadership of Europe beyond its borders. So please let me put forward 3 points that I think are key for the discussion today when it comes to the role of the trade policy and how this is integrated with the industrial strategy. So first point is that we need to put a priority on the long-term competitiveness. This means that we need to attract more investment to the European Union. And for this, we need to have and to create the right framework conditions. Secondly, we need to focus on the technological leadership. This means that we need to maintain the technical and the scientific competence in the field of these key technologies. And coming back to what I said before, the global ecosystem around the supply chain was up to now and is also today a main driver of this technological leadership and competitiveness. The third point, but not the least for certain, is that we need to continue to enhance the market access for our companies by better implementing the existing free trade agreements so that all companies can take the full benefit of this global environment, and they can drive an expansive trade agenda, negotiating with as many foreign trade partners as possible. As our figures were showing, what Malte showed the diagram in the introduction, we see how much our production was falling in the first half of the year and expected to fall into 2020. So we need the international trade to be key to help us to recover from the COVID-19 crisis. I look forward to the discussion today on these very important topics. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rhoda, for your opening statement and for setting our discussion up very neatly. Now, I'm happy to move straight to our panel discussion. And to stimulate the discussion, let's start with a little poll and try to collect some views from all of you in the audience. And this poll is about resilience. We all know more resilience for Europe and for Europe's industry is key, and Rada just explained how we look at this. But I would like to understand how important you feel the trade strategy is for achieving that goal. So here's our poll. Georgiana, you'll walk us through this.
Yes, you should all see the poll on the screen now, and you can just select one of the options. We'll leave maybe 1 minute for everyone to be able to vote, and I'll let you know when I'll close it. Okay, just a few more seconds. So last chance to put something there. And I am now closing it.
Thank you, Georgiana. Well, that's a surprisingly clear-cut result. Thank you very much to all of those who answered. So clearly, there is no doubt in anyone's mind about the role that Europe's trade policy has to play. And I think this is great validation, of course, of the important work which the Commission is doing and you know, how high the stakes are also for the European Commission to get this right. And so I'm really happy now to move to our speaker, bringing the perspective of the European Commission. Kevin Carey, I know you are joining us by phone, and so we don't have you on the screen for everyone to see. Of course, this is due to the very short notice change to make this happen. But I still hope we will be able to hear your contribution very, very well. Now, a question to you, Kevin, to begin our roundtable here, of course, is about the expectations from the future trade strategy and how it connects to Europe's industrial strategy objectives as well. If you could give us some indication of where this will go, and of course, a number of these new elements are already part of the consultation as well. So I suppose, you know, we'll be to some extent familiar with our audience today. We'd love to hear what to expect from this process, and in particular, of course, to understand also what it means in terms of some of the bilateral, multilateral trade discussions where we know much more work is still needed. So Kevin, I give the word to you.
Many thanks, Malta and President Rodriguez, and ladies and gentlemen. And sorry I cannot be present visually in front of you today, but I hope to give you an overview of what the state of play is from the perspective of the Commission under Executive Vice President Dombrovskis. So in line with Malta's questions, I'm going to give some maybe broader points about the future perspectives and how on trade policy and how it connects to industrial strategy objectives, and perhaps take up some specific issues thereafter. Okay, so as you know, trade policy is important to support the competitiveness of EU industry, and it will be a key tool to support recovery, and we'd like to offer our full solidarity to all Orgalim's members who are going through difficult times due to the COVID-19 crisis. Trade policy preserves existing market access and creates new opportunities on foreign markets, including through enforcement actions. As such, trade is an essential element of our industrial policy ambitions. Trade allows for economies of scale and ensures that the most efficient allocation of scarce resources. It also helps create a level playing field through international rules and standards. It's the external arm of the single market. It also helps promote our standards abroad, and it allows for the protection of EU companies against unfair foreign competition. So today I want to convey two important points to you. The first is that European trade policy is one of our success stories and one of our real geostrategic strengths. The second point is that trade will matter more than ever as we strive to recover from COVID-19 and as we push to implement our green and digital transitions. Therefore, we are at this moment, in light of this seminar as well, assessing how to update our trade policy to meet these objectives. Let me remind you and complement what Malte demonstrated in his initial remarks of the impressive scale of our global trade footprint. The EU recorded a surplus of 11.3 billion in goods trade with the rest of the world in August 2020, compared to 10.6 billion in August 2019. Trade supports 1 in 7 high-quality European jobs. Our network of trade agreements is the best in the world, providing us with a platform to create jobs and growth, but also a platform to promote our values and standards and help to shape global rules in cooperation with our partners. It's worth noting that over the next decade, 85% of global growth will happen outside the EU. So we need open trade more than ever if we are to recover quickly from COVID-19. And so for this reason, the EU is leading the effort at international level to keep global supply chains open, resilient and sustainable. We are notably pursuing this work at WTO level with our Trade and Health Initiative and at G20 level. The Commission's Autumn 2020 economic forecast was published just last week, and it projects that the EU economy will contract by 7.4% in 2020 before recovering with growth of 4.1% in 2021. So our businesses, including your members, need to be ready to take advantage of growth potential at home and abroad. In particular, we are convinced that our companies can get even more value from our global network of trade deals. And this is especially the case for our SMEs, of which, Malte, you've already mentioned many are members of Orgalim. This is why we launched the Access to Markets portal last month. And I want to flag this again with your members. It's a one-stop shop to help our companies explore market opportunities around the world. Of course, open trade is equally essential if we are to deliver our ambitious climate and digital agendas, as you also outlined. We must also recall that trade policy must go hand in hand with our internal market and industrial policies. Integration and synergy between our headline policies is the best way to deliver good results. For example, we know that the climate and digital challenges do not end at our external borders. They are global challenges requiring global solutions. So while we work to improve our tools within our own internal market, we also need to strengthen our approaches towards our international partners. In addition to active diplomacy, trade policy can help us to unlock doors of influence around the world. And there are lessons to be learned from the coronavirus pandemic. The resilience of supply chains, as President Rodriguez has outlined, in other words, their ability to adjust reasonably fast in times of crisis, was tested during the crisis, particularly for COVID-19 products. So we need to apply these lessons in our trade policy. It needs to be totally up to date and responsive to the times we live in. Therefore, we are continuing to work to review and update our policy. And as part of this process, for which we appreciate the submission of Orgalim, we will have this communication on a new direction for European trade policy published in early 2021. And obviously the public consultation is ongoing until the 15th. This communication must take into account the changing geopolitical environment. In particular, we really need to redouble our commitment to WTO reform. It is clear that the new trade strategy will have to provide a new strategic direction in our policy. With international tensions on the rise, the crisis of multilateralism, climate change and other new challenges appearing, we need to set a new policy direction to help us navigate these waters and shape the world around us. So this will be based on the much touted buzzword of open strategic autonomy. I suppose simply put, open strategic autonomy means striking the right balance between a Europe that is open and remains open for business, and a Europe that defends its companies and consumers from unfair competition and hostile actions. Whereas it is still a bit early to outline how exactly this will translate into specific strategic priorities, given that our public consultation is still open, it's possible to sketch in broad terms some themes, such as refocusing our efforts on reforming the rules-based multilateral order, contributing to the digital and green transitions, strengthening the EU's regulatory impact, which would also imply a closer integration of internal and external policies. And we need to continue to shape a more assertive approach in our trade policy. This means strengthening our toolbox for trade defense and enforcement. As you will have noted, we have already taken strong steps in this direction with the creation of a Chief Trade Enforcement Officer in the European Commission, Denis Redonnet, and notable recent legislative successes in agreements such as updating the enforcement regulation and dual-use export controls. So the European Union will pursue its own strategic path. We will maintain our role of global leadership in international organizations and conventions, and we will assertively pursue a level playing field for European companies, both in the internal market and in third country markets. We're very hopeful that we will have a revitalized transatlantic relationship to support these goals. And you will have noted the Commission has offered its warm congratulations this week to President-elect Biden. The President-elect, of course, has stated on several occasions that he is a strong supporter of international alliances, of the multilateral system, and of improving ties with the EU. So this week also, President von der Leyen has outlined several areas where Europe could potentially engage with the new administration, notably bilateral trade issues, standards, taxation, etc. So we are hopeful for a positive and forward-looking transatlantic agenda, but we will also stand up for our rights whenever necessary. This is why we launched our countermeasures in the Boeing case, as fully approved by the WTO. We have sought a negotiated settlement on civil aviation and continue to do so. But unfortunately, due to the lack of progress from the US side, we were left with no option. However, EVP Dombrovskis has continued to reiterate that his top priority is for a negotiated settlement. With regard to China, we will also continue our engagement. We are notably continuing negotiations on the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment. Talks are at a rather advanced stage, and our priority issues continue to be market access, level playing field, and sustainable development. We maintain the objective to conclude negotiations by the end of the year. However, this will require China to move significantly. We must also recall the fact that substance should take priority over speed. So in conclusion, I hope it's been possible to give you a good overview of EU trade policy from the perspective of the Commission, including current priorities and future possibilities. And thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Kevin. And really appreciate you doing this tour de force of everything that is going on the trade side. Of course, there is a really extensive agenda which is being developed. I know you have to leave around 4, and so I will take advantage of my prerogative as the moderator to just follow up on one point to make sure I have the chance to ask you this question before you go, which is this on open strategic autonomy. And you know, I appreciate you kind of addressing that head on, and of course you will have heard from Rada Rodriguez that the term continues to cause some concern among our industries, you know, as a sort of potential smokescreen for something that is more protectionist than we would like. I understand that's not what the Commission is itself pursuing. My question is, with a view to the discussions in the Council and among the member state governments, of course there is sort of also a degree of misalignment on what open strategic autonomy should mean. Can you offer us a little bit of a perspective on how you see this this theme of open strategic autonomy being pursued among the governments, and you know, how the Commission is addressing some of those differences or divergences among the governments.
Yeah, thanks, Malte. I suppose there is a range of views, and I suppose this is why the trade policy review consultation process will be so important. I suppose also, if you were to say to make some distinctions, so if you take strategic autonomy, it could be generally understood as the ability for the EU to defend its interests independently. This does not mean, obviously, of course, alone, but without undesired dependencies and without unwanted constraints. But then if you say open strategic autonomy, it kind of extends this definition that by describing a model that on the one hand reaps the benefits of international trade and exerts leadership and full commitment to the international sphere, while on the other hand it simply is about taking necessary measures to increase our resilience and also protect companies and consumers only in situations of unfair trade and abuse. So this is why, you know, a use of trade defense instruments, the Chief Trade Enforcement Officer, the white paper on foreign subsidies, etc. So in essence, I suppose open strategic autonomy is about striking the right balance between a Europe that's open for business and a Europe that protects companies and people. And as I said, I think the trade policy review will be a crucially important platform for elaborating more on this.
Okay, thank you, Kevin. Really appreciate you making yourself available, and you know, by all means, stay as long as you can. Now, let me move on in our panel discussion. And in fact, before we move to the next speaker, we have one more poll for you. We heard about a lot of the different priorities of the Commission, and you know, we can't do justice to those in a very short poll. But if you had to pick one item that stands out for you as the most important, what would that be? And of course, what we are offering here as options is not exhaustive. Of course, the reality is a little more complex than the choices that we are making available here. But let's try to get a snapshot of what you think stands out. So Georgiana, I hand over to you to run the poll.
Thank you. We are already receiving responses from you, and this is a bit of a longer and trickier question, so I'll leave 30 more seconds to just allow everyone to think and make their choice. I really see a different way of answering, and there's no clear-cut answer so far, so that's very interesting. So please do make sure that your vote is there, so we can all see and discuss based on that. Okay, 10 more seconds and then I'll close it.
Okay, thank you, Georgiana. And indeed, no sort of single results that stands out. I suppose confirmation of the importance of free trade agreements, both new ones and making sure we really get the benefit of the existing one. And I think there's a slight plurality of views really saying the focus on implementing the existing ones is the most important. So perhaps no surprise that there is no one silver bullet. In fact, confirms the Commission, of course, is right to look at a lot of these different layers of future trade strategy. I would invite our panelists to also reflect on these results in their remarks and in our Q&A in a moment. If there's anything you want to pick up on in relation to this result, please do. Now, let me move on to our next speaker, and that's René Branders. René is the CEO of FIB Belgium. He's also president of the Belgian Technology Industry Federation, Agoria, which is Orgalim's Belgian member. René, great to have you with us today. And of course, you are in many ways a sort of a prime case study of a European-based SME that is deeply integrated with markets across the world and successful because of your global markets and your global supply chains. What do you expect from the EU? Of course, from the national level, but perhaps for our conversation, most importantly, from the EU to better support a company like FIB Belgium in the future?
Well, I will be really in line, I would say, with the vote that has been done, because if you speak already about the existing market and the existing agreements, one of the main problems is the standards. As you know, in Europe, we are basing all our designs on very high standards. And many countries where you go there are subject also to standard, or they require a European standard, while in the meantime, they apply eventually a local standard that has nothing to do. And of course, it becomes a question of, I will say, discrepancy of the competitiveness in the way that we do not speak about the same standard. We see that quite often with existing countries on which Europe has already trade agreements. And I think this is really a problem, maybe an opportunity also to push also at the level of the Commission in those trade agreements the use of ISO-EN eventually. That could be, I will say then, a leveling of the standards that are applied for both countries. It's quite important in the way that if you supply to those countries, you know which standard you are offering and it is matching with the requirement of the country, while on the opposite side, when you purchase something, you have also the same standard. And there is still a lot of job to be done. The second point is related to the IP. In this frame, a very nice tool that is quite not so well known is the IPA SME Help Desk. As I see that many SMEs going abroad and thinking that they are in an open market are not well prepared regarding their IP. I have the experience even pragmatically of a show where there was two booths, one with a real one, the other one with a fake one, a copy of the logo, very close catalogs, and nothing was able to do by the company coming from Europe, as they had not entitled for an ownership on the brands and on the logo. So there is something there to be done as well. And then those agreements, I take the one that is now in progress, the one of Vietnam, for instance, on the roadmap, I will say, and the communication of how to deal, what are, we say, really the added value that you can take over of those agreements is very often quite unknown from the SME. I know that Europe is communicating a lot about information, but SMEs are usually people, I will say, into a network locally. So why not using, in this case, the network of the Chamber of Commerce, the local Chamber of Commerce, that could be also a perfect ambassador to give to those specific markets all the advantage and, I will say, the opportunities also on a pragmatic way to catch such an opportunity in the country. Now, what I say also is that we have also to find a way about the management of data. We have not to lose as SMEs the new business of data and environmental products, sorry. And in this frame, I would say that the industry of SMEs that are flourishing now in the ICT and that have potential also to develop abroad must be pushed. And in this way, there is a lot of things still to be done, including the facility to have exchange of flow data from one country to another one, being part of the free trade. And in this field, I must say, COVID has shown typically some limitation of video conferencing tools, for which some governments very basically do not agree to have an open platform of exchange that is somewhere jeopardizing, I will say, the two partners, the one locally to come that wants to have a deal with a partner here in Europe, and the partner in Europe that is not able to communicate on a fluent way or in an easy way with his partners locally. That's really the spot I would like to enhance. One question more is that on all those agreements and trades, it's also interesting, I would say, to have a hub or an office very well located in each country, well known, where we can have a single point of contact that knows and that is fully mastering this question there. That's also something, because the big page of the EU, you know, it's not that easy to digest, if I can say that. Yeah.
Thank you, René. I'm going to hold on following up on your points so that we can go to the other speakers and go through them one by one, and then we'll certainly come back to you in a moment and invite, of course, our audience also to send of any questions you might want to ask to René, as well as the other speakers as we go on.
With pleasure.
So let me turn now to our next speaker, Eva Larsen from Vestas. And of course, as Vestas, you are at the heart of the green transition. You are really sort of living and breathing this transition every day here in Europe, and as a leader, of course, across the world. What role does Europe's trade policy play in helping you drive that transition and also turn that into what I mentioned, I think, at the beginning, turning this challenge of climate change into an opportunity for your company, but also, you know, for Europe as a whole?
Yeah, definitely. Let me just first introduce Vestas for those of you who don't know who we are. We are the world's leading provider of wind energy solutions. So we develop, manufacture, install and service wind turbines onshore and offshore, and have done that for more than 40 years. We are headquartered in Denmark, but have a global setup with a big R&D and supply base in Europe, but also globally. We're around 25,000 employees, and have installed turbines in around 82 countries. And further to that, I would also like to give a short introduction to the status of the renewable energy industry in general, because there's some pretty important points to be made here. Today, on a global scale, on average, renewables outperform fossil fuels when it comes to electricity costs, and of course this is something that we've been working on for a long time, and it's a really big achievement, because this is a really key stepping stone to when it comes to decarbonizing our societies. Of course, the decrease in the cost of renewables, and including wind energy, has been done based on technology development. It's also due to a very competitive environment, but it's definitely also due to maturing in supply chains and supply chains becoming more and more global and competitive from that. So Vestas is basically a manufacturer ourselves. We have locations ourselves manufacturing in almost 20 countries, but we also have far more suppliers in even more countries. And I think from that is a pretty clear picture that that we see free trade as a key strength, both in the EU and globally, for us to deliver on cost competitive renewable energy. I think there are some this event starting off with some comments to how many industries are really challenged during the pandemic, and of course there's a real challenges there for many industries. Actually, for renewables, we have seen an increase in 2020. So the renewable industry has proved to be resilient in quite an impressive way during this pandemic. And at least from a Vestas point of view, when we look at how we managed our way through a challenging environment in the pandemic, was actually that we saw a global supply chain, a flexible supply chain, has been a core strength in how we have managed to go through the pandemic in a successful way. So I think onto your question, the way Vestas sees our job and the industry's job is to deliver on a cost competitive renewable energy source, wind energy, and we do this to drive the decarbonization of Europe, but also the global society and economy. We see that definitely that free trade and sensible trade policies are definitely what's going to ensure that the EU wind industry can draw on global supply chains and can be cost competitive in EU and globally against non-EU competitors, but also thinking in here that we are also competing against other energy sources here. Trade policies we see are challenging us, challenging the industry when they are limiting our supply chains, when they are when it makes our ability to be flexible lower. And we have an example now where we see a potential duty of import of towers into to the EU, and I think this is a really clear example of something that can challenge our competitiveness at EU level. Yeah, I think that's where I'll end it for now. Oh, Malte, I can't hear you.
My mistake. So thank you, Eva.
And good. I was worried it was me. Good.
No, my mistake. Thanks for that. And I would love to jump right into it again, but we will move to our next speaker now and come back to you, Eva, in a moment. So let me go to Garrett Workman. Garrett, of course, still morning for you in DC. And I will spare you the question of making predictions about what to expect from the ongoing election drama that we are, of course, all watching with a huge amount of interest here in Europe, as you can imagine. But let's say, irrespective of the outcome of the election, I suppose you have some views on how EU-US discussions on our trade relationships are going to evolve, and the priorities that you also have from the perspective of the US business community, potential opportunities also for convergence, further convergence that you would like to pursue. Would love to hear more on that to help provoke and stimulate a little bit our considerations from the European side. So, Carey, word is yours.
Yes, thank you, Malte, and thank you to all of the Orgalim colleagues for organizing this event. I think it's a really helpful and useful time to have this conversation, and Also, it's great to be working with you all again. We had a nice event on global AI cooperation that we organized with Orgalim a few weeks ago, and we're looking forward to continuing that conversation into the months ahead. So I think it's a really helpful platform that we've created and strong opportunity for transatlantic cooperation across a number of issues. I mean, of course, obviously, everyone has probably been following what's happening in our election. I think it's safe to say that I'm jealous of how fast these polls have been counted on this platform as opposed to some of our elections in some of the states. But at the same time, I think the outcome is fairly clear. I mean, the chamber is obviously on the record of congratulating the president-elect, Joe Biden, and looking forward to working with his administration. Obviously, trade policy is and will continue to be a key focus for the chamber as we look forward to setting the path for a productive recovery from the ongoing pandemic, which obviously has affected all industries in tremendous ways. And the fact that we're having this conversation over webcam is proof enough of the obviously all of the challenges that it's created for everyone, but actually also some opportunities. The fact that we're doing this together in real time across an ocean is also something that we should take advantage of and take note of. You know, as far as the EU trade policy review goes, we're obviously very interested and we'll be submitting comments of our own. You probably all know a little bit about the US Chamber. Let me just briefly say, we're the world's largest trade organization. We represent the interests of about 3 million companies of all sizes across all sectors, mostly US companies, many of whom obviously are deeply involved in the European economy and heavily invested in Europe, and also a number of European companies with significant investments in the US. We have a network of American chambers of commerce abroad. Many of you are probably familiar with the work of our colleagues at AmCham EU there in Brussels, who are sort of like the embassies of the US Chamber. They don't work directly for us, but are helpful network for us to understand what's going on the ground, and for us to sort of coordinate messaging on important issues. And so obviously anything to do with the EU is well coordinated between us at the US Chamber in Washington and our AmCham colleagues over across Europe. There's some key opportunities and some key challenges for us to face together. I think with a new incoming US administration, we're hopeful that we'll have a little bit more policy continuity and predictability, especially with regards to trade. We think there's some near-term opportunities to put some wins on the board. I mean, we should have never put Section 232 tariffs on national security allies. So things like steel and aluminum tariffs, we think, can be taken off fairly quickly as a measure of the good faith and commitment to the alliance and our partnership that the incoming administration will want to show. Clearly, we would like to see a quick resolution to the large civil aircraft dispute, recognizing that this is a 15+ year conversation we've been having with Europe. The announcement earlier this week that the EU was going to actually put tariffs on US exports was challenging. If one reason is just, the piece of legislation that the ruling was against has actually been repealed by Washington State. So, we're happy that there wasn't an immediate response from the current administration to actually escalate this further. And we're obviously still pushing for a negotiated settlement as soon as possible. We will continue to do so. I think things like the oft rumored new tariffs on cars, we can take that threat off the table, which is helpful. But there's a lot of things that are going to remain challenging. I mean, clearly the EU's focus on the digital and green transformation are huge opportunities, but also potential challenges in the transatlantic relationship. When it comes to the digital side, a lot of the transatlantic divergences that have raised up are really the result, in our opinion, of European policy, not exclusively US policy. Clearly things like the Schrems II decision and its impact on data transfers, not just between the US and the EU, but for the EU and its industries to export data anywhere, is a huge challenge for all industries, as we've heard from some of the companies even on this panel. Digital services are not just for the tech companies, they're for all companies. There's some challenges that could arise from the pandemic. I think the focus on building a resilient supply chain is obviously understandable and welcome, but we should also realize that trying to reshore everything would actually make Europe's supply chain much more vulnerable. I mean, if we had a resurgence of the virus, as we've seen, where it was, mostly in Europe, having all of the production in Europe would actually be detrimental to getting supplies where they're needed when they're needed. We should focus on resilience with trusted partners, and I think obviously doing so across the Atlantic would make a whole lot of sense. And then just quickly on the sustainability agenda, obviously there's a lot of debate over something called the carbon border adjustment mechanism. We're going to see conversations on this side of the Atlantic about carbon pricing and maybe our own carbon border adjustment. We're going to have a challenge potentially on that side. We'll see how the Senate shakes out. That's going to make a big impact on the extent of climate policy on this side of the Atlantic. I should mention, obviously, the US is going to rejoin the Paris Agreement, which should remove another sort of irritant in the relationship, which will be helpful. But there's challenges about how is the carbon border adjustment mechanism going to be implemented? Will it be discriminatory? How does it work with the WTO? There's a lot of questions out there, and obviously we want to have a voice at that table. US companies are obviously invested in Europe heavily, have employed millions of Europeans directly and indirectly. And so I think this is a unique opportunity for us to have this conversation, and we want to remain engaged and build on that platform, and hopefully do so in a more optimistic and sort of productive and all-encompassing way under the new administration.
Yeah, so thanks, Garrett. I'm glad to hear the optimism, and certainly you will have felt that also from the reactions of European leaders, and of course ourselves also welcoming the news. So we'll come back to you also in a moment in the questions. Let me turn to our last speaker, Hosuk Limakeyama. And Hosuk, you're, I guess, to some extent going to offer a, could I say, disinterested perspective from a think tank's point of view, so without a sort of immediate particular stake in the discussion, and more to some extent also able to comment from the outside what you're seeing in Europe, and of course what you're seeing in Europe compared to other parts of the world. I know that you have a very strong international outlook, and I take the opportunity to already pick up one point that came in through our questions. By the way, continue to send them. I see some questions coming in here already. One point on the earlier poll, where we saw the different options or the different priorities for Europe's trade strategy. Comment from Jean-Marc Coulon, which is, if you add the third and the fourth, which was about let's be less naive and let's focus more on strategic autonomy, there is a significant number of people in the audience who were saying, essentially, we need to change the way Europe thinks about trade policy, and what we've done in the past is no longer valid in this new environment. So I think that's true. Added together, that was a significant number of people. So perhaps also a question to you: to what extent do you feel this need to get rid of what we did in the past and come up with something new is warranted and right, and to what extent perhaps what we did in the past continues to be right? That would be really interesting to hear from you. So Hosuk, you have the floor.
Thank you, Malte. Maybe I should start off by saying I don't believe in dogmas. I think that we should always reevaluate our options and choose the path of what is feasible. And so I'm actually going to talk just exactly about that I'm not going to talk so much about what the trade strategy should say, because in the end, I think the words relative to action is immaterial. And but also because there is a certain strong sense of reality. And it's not just a question about our choices, but what kind of choices are even available to us and where the reality takes us. The truth is that all major economies, EU, US, and China, have an ever shrinking policy space for trade. There is not that many options, good options out there. And I would even say that devising a trade strategy now is perhaps one of the most difficult tasks. I would even go as far as ungrateful tasks. So I'm very sympathetic to the European Commission and our leaders in the EU, as well as global leaders, in terms of tackling this problem. And Let me start by explaining why the policy space is shrinking. First, the obvious, which is the global macro conditions are quite dire. We have almost, well, more than 7% of global GDP that has been wiped off against previous predictions. That's $6 trillion of economic activities that has been completely wiped off from the global economy. And Europe has actually fared worse than the others, and the Eurozone has dropped at least 10%, and that's even before the second wave or the dynamic effects coming from the equity markets. And in addition to that, the global trading system has fared even worse than our economies in general, and trade has actually declined even worse than those 7%. We are looking at a drop of bigger than 10%. And we should bear in mind that this is happening against a relatively low benchmark because the global trade didn't actually recover from the global financial crisis and the euro crisis until last year. So we are just emerging from a crisis and diving right to the next one. But the most worrying fact for someone like us who live in Europe is that EU export to GDP ratio, our dependency of export remains extremely high. It's about 1/3 of our GDP, and it's almost 2 to 3 times higher than the United States or Japan. We are actually more export dependent than China. If you think that China exports too much, we're even worse. So in sum, export-led growth or recovery is not going to be on the table for a foreseeable future. And that's going to put a major challenge on economies like Germany and Scandinavia, but also EU in overall. And if there's not going to be a trade-led growth, we have to look to the domestic market. But the problem is that unlike United States or China, we are looking, if you look inwards, we are basically looking at a zero growth domestic market. And another problem we have is that the small pockets of growth that will be available during the recovery is simply not large enough because we are the largest economy in the world. You must have a significant driver of growth in order to satisfy our need for economic output. And this is particularly true in, for example, the companies that are represented by the host here today, because we are, of course, globally competitive and we are very export-led. So that looks like a very dark global outlook, and where Europe is actually affected more than the others. And this comes to the question about the lack of policy space, simply because if there is no domestic growth out there, with one exception, China, and I will come back to that later, but the inevitable reaction will be from the European member states that we must displace some imports. It's inevitable. And industrial policy that we are engaging in now must be supported by some kind of fiscal revenue. Hence, for example, the conversation about new revenue sources like digital tax and border tax adjustments. And this is not a moral judgment. I'm not saying that we are evil. I'm not saying that we are not benevolent. I'm just saying that the EU leaders can only play the cards they're being dealt. We don't have that many good options, and we have many objectives that our domestic constituents ask us to fulfill. You cannot square that circle. And if that's the economy, I mean, I'm looking at also the political dimension. And exclusive competence of trade policy on the EU level has always been a sacred. I grew up, well, basically revering 113 article and in the Treaty of Rome, and 133 later, now 207, which is the exclusive competence of trade. We see increasingly that the conflicts with the EU trade policy with core national objectives in EU member states due to commercial rivalry, political constraint, but also to a certain extent, distrust in the EU, that the EU system, the compromise we strike, is actually going to satisfy our national needs. And also the political pressure from the domestic constituents is putting another front to this question, because we are constantly seeking political and moral justification what we can do in terms of trade. I would even go as far as that we need a new mandate from our people and from the citizens just to continue doing what we were always doing, trading. And so the question around values, conditionality on sustainability, social imperatives, the right model of redistribution, and I think the previous trade strategy or the trade communication, trade for all, showed really that we need to tick all the boxes in order to be able to continue what we are always doing. So we need to find people who are sharing values, sharing table manners, protecting the rights exactly in the same fashion as Europe does. That's a very small gene pool. And after we've done a free trade agreement with Japan, which was a borderline case for some people in the civil society, we are probably left with just New Zealand that we can do free trade agreements with. That's not going to satisfy our need for growth. And also one factor that I would like to add here is that we are increasingly unable to do trade-offs. Basically, there has to be a give and take in every trade negotiation. So that means that you have to give something to the other side in order to get something. If you look at recent agreements like Mercosur, shows that we have to win on everything. And that's not really how diplomatic negotiations are conducted. So just to wrap it up, as far as we can see, there's only one market that has returned to growth, and that's China. China is opening up for investment, but not for imports. And that is going to lead to some form of a conflict in values between Europe and China. And it is a bigger problem for us than, for example, for the United States, because we haven't really graduated from an export-driven trade model. We don't do investment-led trade. We don't do, well, intellectual, intangible-led trade. And so, in other words, China is unlikely to open up to Europe, and because that's simply not what's happening at the moment. And if it does, it's probably going to open up to other countries first. And I was really intrigued by the question around strategic autonomy, because we are very legalistic in Europe. We are looking at a concept, we are looking at definitions, and in the end, a part of the problem is the fact that the United States is more productive and competitive than Europe in certain parts of the value chain. There are also really genuine problems around strategic influence that China exercises into a value chain. And for example, in the 5G area, due to some of the laws that China has in place in order to collect their intelligence. But fundamentally, I think France is the country who really gets it right on this question. It might come as a surprise, but for us, autonomy is effectively about choice. And when we are faced with a monopoly, or when we are faced with just one source, that is the absence of choice. And if Europe is given a choice, we are always going to do the right decision. So
I'm going to ask you to just bring it to a conclusion in a moment, because I really want to get to the final poll and ask some of the points that you're addressing to other panelists. So if I could ask you to bring it to this part to a conclusion, and then we come back to some of the points and the questions in a moment.
To wrap it up, strategic autonomy is part commercial competition, but also there is a genuine element of risk. And what I see right now is a political rhetoric around diversification. But what's happening in reality is that the European companies are currently onshoring into China, because that's where the growth has returned. Thank you so much.
This was very, very rich in terms of helping us understand a little bit the dynamics, of course. And so I really appreciate that. And I would love to come back to some of those points in a moment. Let me pick up on the point about reshoring, about the dependence that Europe has perhaps disproportionately to trade for our success, and therefore the risk that protectionism also poses to us. And the question we want to ask you is essentially, how concerned are you that Europe may turn more protectionist in the years ahead? So open question, Georgiana, over to you.
Yes, the poll is on and we're receiving a lot of answers. And we'll leave, as usual, more or less a minute for everyone to be able to vote. Okay, a few more seconds, please. And I'm closing.
Okay. So I was actually expecting, given the audience that we have assembled here, I was expecting even more of us to say we are very concerned, which I think is what typically you will hear from our industries. Not that this is necessarily expected to happen, but that there is a real concern about the damage it would cause. So still serious level of concern if you add the very end somewhat, but not as sort of singular as I had expected the answer to be. Okay, very good. Now let me pick up on some of the points that were mentioned and also the questions that were coming in. And I wanted to come back to René Branders. This conversation around, if I could ask all the panelists to put their cameras on, by the way, so we can see each other. This question around protectionism, around our dependence on global markets and also global supply chains. What does the discussion on reshoring mean to you? You know, we heard from Eva a moment ago that for Vestas this is a genuine issue if they don't have access to production sites where it makes commercial sense and operational sense. How do you see this from the perspective of a Belgian-based SME?
We say on the reshoring, the things is that COVID has shown already our full dependency, I would say, of the ICT industry from outside, not in Europe. So we have to grab there something inside. And as a matter of fact, and that's what Mr. Hosouk says, is that indeed, when you look to the new investments are happening often outside the borders of Europe. Europe remaining, I will say, a market on which innovation can be done, where we have partners to develop new technologies. But those new technologies, if they are immediately adopted outside the border of Europe to be competitive, it's not the case here, quite often here in Europe. Questions of investments, there are also some problems related to, I would say, the procedures when you need to reinvest something, you need to make a reassessment of the impact, environmental impact. And it's a matter of fact that in the industry, we see a lot of investments and customers that are outside the border of Europe. That's a matter of fact. The question, for instance, if you look to the electrical car, is also a nice topic in this field. You go to China, to Guangzhou, all buses, cars, bikes are moving with electricity. While on the vision of Europe, we are just discussing if we have a hydrogen, if we have electric, but we don't have the infrastructure for electrical pool. So we have something to do there, also for the internal market, in my opinion. But we have not to lose the agenda of data. And there, today, we are really, really far ahead of the runners across the world. We must be really careful for that, because the new job and the new industry will also depend on smart products and the mastering of those technology. Artificial intelligence is one thing. It should become also a European product.
Yeah, thank you, René. And indeed, it was interesting, I think, in Garrett's comments earlier that the twin digital and green transformation, which are, of course, the anchors of European policy here, that they are, of course, opportunities for American-based companies also, but to some extent, they're also causing tension. And I think you mentioned some of the points around data and digitalization, and then you mentioned the elements of the green transformation, which are also not straightforward in the transatlantic relationship, carbon border adjustment mechanism being, the obvious example. And there's a question on this from Toma Mikalauskaite, also coming in on the chat here. What would be the impact of a carbon border adjustment tax on I guess, question to Eva on Vestas, if you have a way of answering that, and then of course to Renee and anyone else that would be interested to respond to this.
Yeah, I can start, though I can't give a full answer until we know how it would look like. I would say that the carbon adjustment mechanism, I mean, in principle, we fully support that. I mean, the polluter pays principle, of course, if you're a wind turbine manufacturer, you see that logic makes sense. I think also it makes sense to most people, right? But of course, also being on the one side a green company, on the other side also a company highly dependent on a global supply chain. We're also, of course, very much aware that this is not something that should impact the competitiveness of the industry in Europe. So it's in principle, of course, it's something that we support a lot, but it's hard to give much of an answer before we know how it would look like, I would say, from my perspective.
Any other points on the carbon border adjustment mechanism that anyone wants to add?
If I may jump in?
Yes, Wto. Yeah.
No, I mean, there are real political and practical complications. I mean, I live in a world where we can't even determine where things come from. Rules of origin is complicated enough. So in that world, how are we going to determine the carbon content of an imported product? So we would need to take shortcuts. Shortcut leads to disputes. Disputes lead to retaliation or a WTO case. This is an inevitable effect of a unilateral carbon tax that is only imposed at the border. It will come at a significant cost, and this is perhaps one of the problems with trade strategy, which is that there has to be some kind of a consequential thinking. Whether we're talking about digital taxes that Mr. Workman was talking about, or we are talking about carbon taxes, it will lead to reciprocation or complication where we may not be able to stand our ground.
Okay, well, thank you for being very explicit on this point, and I think is echoed by our very simple point that it may be one thing to apply a carbon border adjustment to a relatively simple product, let's say steel, very different exercise to do that to an extremely complex product with a huge amount of different components sourced from all over the world, which of course is the rule for most of our companies. Please put your hand up if you wanted to say anything on this, because then otherwise I will go on to the next question, which is also questions, different points coming in via the chat, of course, to do with China. And of course, the ongoing points on the investment agreement with China that Kevin mentioned. Notwithstanding, there is a real concern that Europe is not in a good position in terms of the dynamics and the strength that China has in this more messy, more unpredictable dynamic. And question to Garrett, I guess, do you feel in the US business community, do you feel a similar sense of nervousness around how to deal with with the resurgent China, and what kind of measures are considered to be appropriate, not by the administration but by the business community, as far as you can see, in managing that relationship?
Well, thanks for that question. It's a very important one, and probably this is an issue where we'll probably see more continuity rather than change as far as the U.S. administration goes of any political stripe, where basically everyone agrees that China is the main challenge to deal with as far as international economic policy. I mean, not just economic policy, but primarily for this conversation. I think it's helpful that we've seen a few announcements. Hopefully they will be maintained in a new administration, of things like a trade and technology council between the US and the EU, and also this dialogue on China. that the High Representative and the Secretary of State have set up, recognizing belatedly, in our view, the importance of this issue. And I think we've seen a shift from our perspective of the European business community's views on China, which has been helpful. I think there's a US business community pretty far ahead still of what we would be willing to do vis-a-vis China. You have a lot of the consumer-led products and services companies which are shut out of China completely, right? If you think about the major tech companies in particular, who are probably more willing than most in Europe to go after China. And then you have, the broader business community has seen its intellectual property be expropriated, has seen, these forced technology transfers, has seen and sees a need for cooperation with like-minded countries on things like export controls. So we're hopeful that the recent news out of Brussels might lend itself to cooperation on that front. Also, obviously, we need WTO reform. I mean, we saw this agreement between the US, EU, and Japan earlier this year on subsidies. What happened to that? We need some movement to actually implement this if we're going to have any say at all. And I think obviously the pandemic has only exacerbated and accelerated these trends with the fact that, as Hosuk mentioned, China is the only country that's doing well right now, and frankly is pretty much recovered from the virus. Its economy is already growing. This is going to make this problem worse, not better. And I think we need, collectively, we're still a pretty significant chunk of the world economy. We get in countries like Japan and Australia and some others, Canada. We might actually be able to have some sway here. But if we continue the US administration's previous approach of trying to go it alone, it's only going to hurt US industry. And I think we need help from the European business community to recognize the challenges that China presents and for us to address these challenges together.
And I'm conscious that we are almost at the end of our time here, but I want to ask this question to Renee very bluntly. How vulnerable do you feel to Chinese competitors and the ability of Europe and Europe's trade policy to protect you if that is indeed what you are looking for?
I would say, if we speak protection, I don't think it is really the right word to use. But we have a frame here of legislation in Europe. And obviously sometimes, and quite, I will not say, I will not give in countries here, but goods are passing the borders and that are absolutely not in line, for instance, with the machine directive. It's going like that. In this frame, I will say, China has a very clear law about IP. It's coming from the German even, basically. The question is that many people do not know which is inside that law when you go by China. The questions we have there is, of course, the competitiveness of this and innovation. Today, up to now, I will say, China was following Europe. Now, the problem is that by allowing, for instance, all the developments in 5Gs and what they have in hands, they will run much more faster than we do. And the innovation is happening today in those countries compared to here. And it is therefore maybe that in the framework of what we call the Green Deal and the environment, that we build the right standards here in those countries, here in Europe, on which we are able also to create this innovation and to recognize this innovation to be sold outside. My challenge as well are the framework, but it's a different topic here related to banking, the banking systems, on which Europe is not able to offer, when there are big investment abroad, the same conditions as the Bank of China is offering in huge projects. And those conditions not being able to be coupled with big investments makes that there are also some challenge and stress, I will say. Conditions are fantastic, what they offer. For instance, investment in Russia, you cannot imagine the financial conditions they offer compared to suppliers that are coming here from Europe, from the next door, source of Belgium, if I can put a position there.
Okay, well, thank you, Renee. And I'm really sad that we are out of time because I would love to pursue this further. And I was very, very grateful for all the speakers to take their time and be with us this afternoon, this morning, and for the rich contribution that you made. So really a big thank you from all of us at Orgalim, and a big thank you to everyone who joined us on the web today. Please let us know what you thought. There's a quick survey at the end. As always, of course, we are on Twitter and look forward to your contributions. And come back to our website for follow-up on our webinar. And if you want to relive it with the recording, that will be up very soon. That brings us to the end of our session today. Very big thanks for joining, and I look forward to seeing you very soon.